The pen felt lighter than I expected. I always thought the moment you sign away 22 years of your life would feel like something, like the ground should tilt. Instead, it just glided, smooth and quiet, the way it used to glide across ledgers back when I still believed columns of numbers could hold a marriage together. Beside me, my husband could barely sit still. Nathaniel Cross had his good suit on, the charcoal one, and every few seconds his eyes dropped to his phone hidden beneath the edge of the table. I knew who he was texting. I didn't need to see the screen to know. The courtroom smelled like every courtroom does. Old paper, burnt coffee, the staleness of a room built for endings. My hands stayed folded in my lap the way my mother taught me, the way a woman folds her hands when she has decided, finally, not to let her face give anything away. Across the aisle, Nathaniel sat like a man already celebrating a win he hadn't earned. He was getting the house with the wraparound porch, the company I had kept breathing through the 2 recessions using spreadsheets he never once opened, the lake house, the investment accounts, every asset that had our names stitched together after 2 decades of marriage. I was getting our twins, full custody of Owen and Grace, 17 years old, 6 months from leaving for college, 6 months from not needing full custody of anything at all. My attorney, Regina Hale, leaned toward me one final time before the judge called the room to order. She'd fought me on this plan for 3 straight weeks. "Natalie," she whispered, pen hovering above her legal pad like she still believed there was time to stop this. "You don't have to do this." "That's exactly why I'm doing it," I told her. She didn't understand yet. Nobody in that room did, except maybe the quiet man who had drafted a document 19 years earlier and never lived to see how much it would matter. Judge Whitfield, no relation, just a coincidence of a name I'd come to find almost funny, was a woman in her 50s with the flat, practiced tone of someone who had watched this exact scene play out 1,000 times. "Mrs. Cross, I need to confirm you understand what you're agreeing to. You are relinquishing your claim to nearly every marital asset, including the primary residence, the business, and all investment accounts. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. I've had adequate counsel and time to consider this, and I'm entering it freely." Nathaniel shifted in his seat. I saw it then, the thing I'd been watching for since we walked in. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, just enough. He thought he had won a war without ever having to fight it. His mother, Marilyn, sat behind him in her Sunday pearls, and when our eyes met, she smiled at me too. The same smile she'd worn at every holiday dinner for 20 years, the one that said she'd always known I wasn't quite good enough for her son. Nathaniel signed fast, too fast, the way people sign things they've already spent in their heads. I watched the pen move and thought about our first apartment, 400 square feet above a laundromat, the hum of dryers through the wall at night, the way he used to fall asleep with his head on my stomach while I balanced his father's old truck receipts by lamplight. I thought about how far a person can travel from who they used to be, and how rarely they notice the distance until somebody holds up a mirror. The judge nodded, satisfied, and reached for the next folder in the stack. I recognized the thickness of it, the weight of paper that had been sitting quietly in Regina's briefcase since Tuesday. She opened it slowly, read the first page. Read it again. Nathaniel didn't notice at first. He was already halfway out of the courtroom in his mind, probably composing a text about dinner reservations. It was Marilyn who noticed the shift in the judge's face first, the small crease forming between her eyebrows. I watched Marilyn's smile falter for the first time in 17 years. The judge looked up, not at me, at Nathaniel. "Mr. Cross," she said slowly, "are you aware of a document filed with this court under the name Ashworth Family Trust?" Nathaniel's smile went out like a light in a house seen from the outside. "What?" he said. I sat very still, hands folded, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter, something closer to peace. But to understand why I gave away everything I'd built, why I sat in that courtroom and let my husband believe he'd won, you have to go back. Not to this morning, not even to this year, but nearly 3 years earlier, to a letter I was never supposed to see, and a promise my grandfather made me long before I understood what it would cost or what it would save. People always ask how a marriage travels from its beginning to its end, as if there's one door that slams shut all at once. There isn't. There's only a long hallway of small doors closing quietly, one after another, until you turn around one day and realize you're standing in the dark without remembering when the light went out. I met Nathaniel when I was 24, freshly certified as a CPA, working 60-hour weeks at a mid-sized accounting firm downtown. He was 26, driving a pickup with a cracked windshield, handing out business cards he'd printed himself. Cross builders, reliable work, fair prices, 2 employees, both cousins, a cement mixer he was still paying off, dust on his boots, a way of looking at me like I was the only person in the room. I fell for that look before I fell for anything else about him. We married 18 months later in my parents' backyard. Within a year, I was doing his books at the kitchen table after my own shifts ended. I built his invoicing system, filed his license renewals, and walked into his first bank meeting with a binder of projections I'd built myself, talking numbers to a loan officer who kept glancing past me toward Nathaniel like he expected the real answers to come from him. Nathaniel understood concrete and framing and how to read a room full of subcontractors. That mattered. I never denied it mattered. But a company doesn't survive on framing alone. It survives on the person who keeps the lights on when a client is 60 days late, who manages payroll through the slow winter months, who says no to the truck before the numbers can support it. That person was me for almost a decade, unpaid, unlisted, unnamed on anything but a tax return. Then the twins came. I remember holding Owen in one arm and Grace in the other, exhausted in a way I didn't know a body could survive, while Nathaniel stood in the doorway on his phone, already talking timelines with the supplier. I went home. I nursed 2 babies through the night, and slowly, without ever deciding to, I stopped going into the office. The business grew without my hands directly on it, because Nathaniel had hired an actual bookkeeper who called him visionary in emails I sometimes saw over his shoulder. He started appearing in the regional business journal. Cross Builders founder turns family business into regional powerhouse. I read that article standing at the kitchen counter with baby food on my sleeve, and nowhere in 4 columns of print was my name mentioned. It didn't happen all at once. The distance. It happened in layers. He started coming home later, always with a reason. He started making decisions about money without mentioning them to me first, decisions I only discovered when statements arrived in the mail. He stopped asking what I thought. Marilyn didn't help. She'd come for Sunday dinners and talk about Nathaniel's success like it had sprung fully formed from his own 2 hands. "My son built all of this himself," she said once, glancing at me like I was the help who had wandered too close to the good china. I never corrected her. I stayed quiet through most of it. That was who I'd always been, a woman who watched more than she spoke, who believed dignity meant not making a scene, even as the scene built itself around me, brick by brick. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago, I was sorting mail at the kitchen island when I found an envelope from a bank I didn't recognize, addressed to Nathaniel, marked personal and confidential. I almost set it aside. I didn't. The letter inside was a confirmation notice from a private wealth firm referencing an account restructuring already completed. Nathaniel had moved significant money into holding entities I'd never heard of, entities that existed, as far as I could tell, purely to separate assets from our marriage on paper, long before divorce had ever been mentioned aloud. I called an old colleague, a forensic auditor named Priya, and asked her, hypothetically, what it would mean if a business owner started restructuring assets while his wife had no idea. It means, Priya said, he's either protecting himself from a lawsuit or he's protecting himself from you. I already knew which one it was. Over the following weeks, I pulled at threads quietly, the way I used to trace discrepancies in a ledger. Nathaniel had begun the process 18 months earlier, not long after Marilyn had started introducing him at parties as practically a free man, now that the kids are almost grown. He'd been seeing a woman named Dana from his supplier's sales team for nearly a year, though I didn't have proof yet. Only the particular feeling a wife develops when she stops being asked where she wants to go to dinner. There were nights I cried in the bathroom with the fan running so the twins wouldn't hear. And nights I didn't cry at all, just lay awake calculating, the accountant in me refusing to let the wife in me fall apart completely. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I remembered my grandfather. Walter Ashworth had been a quiet man, a retired attorney who spent his last 15 years fishing a lake in Michigan. When he died, I was 28, still believing wholeheartedly in the life I was building. He'd left me something in his will, a modestly funded trust, structured as what his own attorney called an irrevocable trust. I remembered signing paperwork at his lawyer's office, half listening, and my grandfather squeezing my hand afterward, saying something I hadn't thought about in years. This isn't for the good years, Natalie. This is for if the bad ones come. I found the documents in a fireproof box in the attic, beneath old tax returns and the twins' baby books. 41 pages, dense with language I hadn't read since I was a young CPA. I called Priya again, and on her recommendation, an estate attorney named Regina Hale, a woman with silver hair and a reputation for being unshakable in a courtroom. Regina read through the trust for nearly 2 hours in her office while I sat across from her, watching her expression shift from professional neutrality into something sharper. "Do you understand what your grandfather built for you?" she finally asked. I told her I understood the basics: stocks, some land, a modest inheritance. "It's grown," she said, "substantially. And more importantly, it's structured so that it activates fully, distributing the entirety of its holdings to you if you cease to hold a majority interest in marital assets. Your grandfather built a contingency, Natalie. He built it assuming a day might come when you had nothing left in your own name." I sat very still, except this time it wasn't grief keeping me quiet. It was the slow, dawning shape of something else entirely, something that felt less like fear and more, for the first time in years, like the ground shifting firmly back beneath my feet. Nathaniel had spent 18 months making sure I would leave our marriage with nothing. He had no idea that leaving with nothing was about to make me wealthier than he had ever imagined possible. Regina did not like my plan. She told me so plainly, sitting across from me in her office with the trust documents spread between us like a hand of cards only I understood how to play. "You could fight for half of everything," she said. "The house, the business valuation, the investment accounts. Given what he's done, moving assets without disclosure, a judge would not look kindly on him. You could walk away with millions, Natalie, and still keep your trust untouched. Why would you give up a fight you're likely to win?" I understood her confusion. On paper, it made no sense. I could have dragged the affair into discovery, spent 2 years bleeding him financially and emotionally, the way he'd apparently been prepared to bleed me, but I didn't want his money. I wanted something he couldn't calculate, couldn't see coming, couldn't build a defense against, because he wouldn't even know it existed until it was already his loss. "I know this looks like I'm losing my mind," I told Regina, "but I need you to trust me the way I trust what my grandfather built." It took her 3 meetings to come around, and even then, I don't think she fully believed I wouldn't change my mind the morning of the hearing. She filed the trust notice sealed and separate from the general divorce filing, exactly as the law allowed, ready to be introduced only once the settlement was finalized. Once Nathaniel's signature was already dry on paper, he couldn't take back. At home, I told no one. Not my sister, not my closest friend from church, not even Owen and Grace, though they were old enough to sense something was wrong. Nathaniel, meanwhile, had never been happier. He moved out in November into a rental he described to Marilyn as temporary, though it had art on the walls within 2 weeks. He started appearing at the twins' games with Dana, trailing a few steps behind him. He bought a new truck, not because he needed one, but because he could. Because for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't running numbers past me first. Marilyn took me to lunch once, ostensibly to discuss college plans, though I understood it was really an audition for her role as the reasonable mother-in-law. Nathaniel built that company from nothing, she reminded me. It wouldn't be fair to tear it apart in court. I told her I understood more than she knew, and let her interpret that however she wanted. The hardest part wasn't Nathaniel. It wasn't even Marilyn. It was Owen and Grace, watching their mother agree to walk away from the only home they'd ever known without a fight. Grace found me in the kitchen one night, lease documents for our future apartment spread across the counter, and asked the question I could see she'd been holding for weeks. "Mom, why aren't you fighting? Everyone knows what he did. Everyone knows about her." I set down my pen and looked at my daughter, 17, already sharper than I'd been at that age. "Sometimes winning doesn't look like fighting, Grace," I said. "Sometimes it looks like letting someone believe they've already won." She didn't understand. I didn't expect her to. Not yet. Owen was quieter about it, but I caught him watching me some evenings with a kind of worry, usually reserved for parents watching their children. Not the other way around. It broke something small in me every time. By the time the court date arrived in early spring, Nathaniel had already picked out a ring for Dana, according to a cousin who still spoke to me out of old loyalty. He'd already started designing an addition to the lake house he was about to own outright. He walked into that courtroom the way a man walks into a party thrown in his honor, straightening his tie, barely glancing at me, already halfway into the rest of his life. He had no idea that the rest of his life was about to look nothing like he'd planned. We're back where this story began. Nathaniel had already signed everything: house, business, investment accounts, with the easy confidence of a man closing a deal he'd spent a dozen times in his imagination. His attorney, a sharp young man named Cole Bennett, sat beside him, looking equally relaxed, glancing at his watch. Then came the second folder. "Mr. Cross," the judge said, "are you aware of a document filed with this court under the name Ashworth Family Trust?" Nathaniel's face went blank, then confused, then something close to afraid. "What?" He looked to Cole Bennett, who was already flipping through his own copy with rising alarm. Regina stood, calm as still water. "Your Honor, this trust was established by Mrs. Cross's late grandfather over 19 years ago. It is irrevocable, fully documented, and entirely separate from marital property. Its assets are excluded from the estate under both federal and state law. Notice was filed with the court, as required, not with opposing counsel, since Mrs. Cross was not seeking any claim against it. Your Honor, if this trust is being triggered by today's settlement, we'd need time to review," Bennett said. "There's nothing to review, Counselor," Regina replied. "The activation clause was triggered the moment Mrs. Cross relinquished her interest in the marital estate today, of her own free will, as this court has already confirmed." I sat still, hands folded, something in my chest loosening like a held breath released. I didn't look at Nathaniel. I didn't need to. The judge turned to him. "Were you aware, Ronald, prior to signing of this trust?" "No," he said, voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I had no idea. Was anything concealed or withheld during discovery?" "No, Your Honor," Regina answered. "This was never a marital asset. Mr. Cross had no obligation to inquire about property belonging separately to his wife, and Mrs. Cross had no obligation to volunteer it." The judge looked between us. This settlement was entered freely, with full counsel, and I see no fraud regarding the marital estate. The trust is a separate matter outside my jurisdiction. She looked at Nathaniel, not unkindly. Surprise is not the same as deception. You signed with full knowledge of what you were receiving. I watched something collapse behind his eyes, a man realizing in real time that the story he told himself for months was never the true one. He'd walked in certain he was the one taking everything. He was only now understanding that certainty had made him careless. He shot up so fast his chair scraped the floor. This isn't right. She hid this from me. Mr. Cross, sit down and consult your attorney, the judge said, calm and flat. He didn't sit. He turned to me instead, composure gone, replaced by raw disbelief. You knew? This whole time you knew, and you let me think I was winning. I looked at him, the boy with the dust on his boots and a cracked windshield, now standing in an $800 suit, accusing me of a crime I hadn't committed. I never lied to you, Nathaniel, I said, steadier than I expected. You asked for everything. I gave you everything you asked for. He hired a new attorney within the week, determined to have the settlement thrown out. But Regina had built the agreement too carefully for that door to open. Every signature witnessed, every disclosure legally sound, every asset exactly what he demanded in mediation. The trust wasn't hidden through deception. It simply had never been his to ask about. The final ruling came 6 weeks later. The judge denied his motion. Nathaniel Cross was not defrauded. He had simply never asked the right questions of a wife he'd stopped seeing as anything more than a woman who kept his books and raised his children. Marilyn came to see me once near the end of it all, standing on my new porch in her Sunday pearls. You could have warned him, she said. 20 years, Natalie. You could have said something before he made such a fool of himself. He made a fool of himself the day he stopped asking what I knew, I told her. For the first time in 17 years, Marilyn had nothing to say to me at all. The truth, which I only fully understood in the weeks that followed, was that Nathaniel had never actually built an empire alone. He'd built a business, a good one, profitable and respected. But a business is not a fortune, not in the way that matters. A fortune is what survives you, what compounds quietly in the background while you're busy convincing yourself and everyone else that you did it all with your own two hands. My grandfather had understood that decades before I did, sitting on his porch in Michigan with his fishing rod and his paperback westerns, building something patient and protected for a granddaughter he suspected might one day need protecting from a love that looked steadier than it was. Nathaniel kept the company. He kept the house, the lake property, the investment accounts, every asset he'd fought so hard to claim in that courtroom. On paper, he'd won everything he'd asked for, but I watched, in the months that followed, as the cost of that victory revealed itself slowly, the way costs often do. Dana didn't stay once she understood there wasn't a windfall coming his way, once she realized the man she'd attached herself to had a mortgage on the lake house he'd bragged about, and a business that, without my quiet management behind it for 2 decades, was already showing cracks in its cash flow a hired bookkeeper hadn't caught in time. Nathaniel had built his identity on being a man who needed nothing and no one. Now, for the first time in his adult life, he was going to find out exactly how much of that identity had ever been true, and how much of it had simply been me, standing quietly behind him, making sure he never had to. I left the courthouse that afternoon without looking back at the man still arguing with his attorney in the hallway. Owen and Grace were waiting in the car, and when I got in, Grace reached over and squeezed my hand without saying anything at all, like she finally understood something she hadn't a few weeks earlier. I drove us home in the late afternoon light spread gold across the windshield, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the road ahead didn't feel like something I was enduring. It felt like something that finally, quietly, belonged to me. 8 months have passed since that afternoon in the courtroom, and Nathaniel still has everything he fought so hard to keep. The house with the wraparound porch, the business with his name painted across every truck, the lake property, the cars, the investment accounts he guarded so carefully during our divorce, certain that holding on to them meant he'd won. I never went back for any of it. I never wanted to. There's a particular kind of freedom in walking away from a life you built with your own hands and letting someone else keep the walls, because walls were never what I was fighting for. The trust began distributing assets almost immediately after the settlement finalized, exactly as my grandfather had designed it to nearly 2 decades earlier. I didn't buy anything extravagant. I found a small house 2 streets back from the beach, in a town an hour from where the twins grew up, close enough that they could still come home on weekends, far enough that it felt like starting over instead of just moving down the block from my old life. It has a kitchen window that looks out over a garden I'm slowly learning to keep alive, and some mornings I stand there with my coffee and realize I haven't thought about Nathaniel at all. Not out of bitterness fading, but out of a life quietly filling in around me instead. Owen and Grace both got into good colleges this spring. Grace wants to study finance, which made me laugh the first time she told me, standing in my new kitchen with her acceptance letter in hand, though I don't think she fully understood why until I explained a little more about her great-grandfather and the trust he'd built for a granddaughter he never lived to see need it. Owen is quieter about his plans, the way he's always been, but he calls me most Sundays now, longer conversations than we ever had when he lived under Nathaniel's roof, measuring his words around his father's moods. Nathaniel reached out a few times over the summer, mostly logistics about move-in dates. But one evening in July, he called about something else entirely. I could hear it in his voice before he even said it. That particular unsteadiness of a man who'd spent months turning something over in his mind and finally decided to say it out loud. "You could have told me," he said, "about the trust before any of this happened." I stood on my porch, watching the last of the light fade over water 2 streets away, and thought about how many years I'd spent waiting for him to ask me a real question. Any real question about who I was, or what I carried, or what I built quietly beside him while he collected the credit. "You never asked," I said. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that used to make me anxious back when I still needed his silences to mean something reassuring. It didn't anymore. "So this was revenge," he said finally. Not quite a question. "No," I told him, and I meant it more fully than I think he'll ever understand. "I didn't do any of this to hurt you, Nathaniel. I simply stopped protecting you from your own greed. What happened after that was never mine to control." He didn't have a response for that. We hung up a few minutes later, polite in the way 2 people can be once the fighting has finally gone out of them. People ask me sometimes if I regret not fighting harder in that courtroom, not taking half of everything I helped build over 22 years. I tell them the truth. I didn't lose that fight. I simply chose a different one. There's a version of strength that looks like clenched fists and courtroom battles. And there's another version that looks like quietly signing your name, walking out the door, and trusting that the things worth having were never the things anyone could take from you in the first place. My grandfather understood that. It took me most of my adult life to understand it too. If you're sitting somewhere right now feeling like you've lost everything to someone who never truly saw what you were worth, I want you to hear this. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting for what's yours. It's trusting that what's truly yours was never something they could take.